This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. All right, so we are here. I'm here with Professor Michael Glennon of Tufts University. We're going to talk about his book, National Security and Double Government, and a number of things that kind of stem from that. So first, Professor Glennon, good morning. Thank you for being with me. And let's start. I think before we get to the thesis of the book, which I think an outside observer without your particular care for language might call an expose of the national security deep state. Let me get a sense of your background. You know, you've been at Tufts for a good while now, but you did not start there. It's my understanding you started on Capitol Hill, and I'd love to get a sense of that, what you were doing there, and how that led you down this path.
Yes. Well, thank you, Nick. It's a delight to be with you this morning. Thanks for inviting me. I did start my career on Capitol Hill with the United States Senate in 1973. Right after I graduated from law school, I joined the Senate Legislative Counsel's office, which is kind of an in-house law firm for the Senate. It does all the Senate's legal work, and was assigned to work for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I did all their legal work after a little while, and then joined the staff of the committee in 1975-77 as its legal counsel, and did all the legal work on all the treaties before the committee, the Panama Canal Treaty, the SALT II Treaty, war powers issues, war powers oversight, intelligence oversight, which we can talk about in a bit. It's kind of the impetus behind the book, although I don't describe that in the book.
Yeah.
So I developed a strong belief in separation of powers and congressional oversight and the importance of pluralism in national security decision-making.
Interesting. Okay, so let's go right into that. You talk about oversight, and so the big figure in oversight during that period was Senator Frank Church from Idaho. He's certainly one of the big ones.
Yes.
Recently read James Rising's book, The Last Honest Man.
Yes, it's an
which was terrific book. I've actually been meaning to write about it, but Frank Church certainly was someone that really believed in oversight, and there was a lot going on with that at that period. Would you be willing to kind of give your side of that, what was going on at the time, and what that looked like from your angle?
Sure. I worked very closely with Frank Church, of course. He was the chairman while I was there, and I admired him immensely. I thought he was a brave man. He stood up to the national security state as no one else has, as this book, The Last Honest Man, details, and I hope people read it. I was involved when I was with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in a very intense study of the activities of foreign intelligence agencies in the United States. And in the process of conducting that, we interviewed dozens of people in Langley, Fort Meade, FBI headquarters, Justice Department, uh, and read thousands of pages of classified documents. And this really relates to the book. I was
Mhm.
stunned at how little change occurred in our national security policy from the Ford administration to the Carter administration
Mhm.
in 1977 when they took office. It was as though nothing changed. I mean, there are many, many examples that I could give you, but
Yeah.
there was, for example, a guy who was the deputy legal advisor of the State Department who wrote all of the war powers position papers for the legal advisor's office during the Ford administration. The same individual continued to write position papers for the State Department during the Carter administration. No change whatsoever. This
Yeah.
replicated over and over and over and over. And so the nexus to the book is obvious. During the Obama administration, I was struck once again by a sense of deja vu. I've seen this before. The Carter or Carter Obama was pursuing the same national security policies as his predecessor, um, George W. Bush, even though he campaigned on the theme of change we can believe in. There was no change. And that was
Yeah.
particularly obvious behind the scenes, I think, as it was during the Ford administration. So one rainy day, I pulled a book off the shelf called The English Constitution, which I had not read before, by Walter Bagehot, written in
Mhm.
like 1868. This
Mhm.
fellow, Bagehot, was the principal founder of The Economist magazine. He was a prominent public intellectual, constitutional scholar, economist, and I almost read the entire book in one sitting. It just explained to me in very clear and cogent terms the reason behind this strange continuity in American foreign national security policy.
Mhm.
So that's a long answer to a short question, but the my earlier experience came together in writing this book.
Yeah. And it's not like, it's funny because when as I was reading the book, and we'll kind of get into, more of your thesis and the terminology you use, Madisonian, Trumanite, all that. Um, but it's funny, reading it because I approach this as someone a lawyer, worked on Wall Street. It's like I with great love for the not just kind of the public facing institutions, these dignified or Madisonian as you call them, and we'll get into that, but with love for the experts too. Like what some of my friends and relatives who don't have the same familiarity or intimacy with the government would call the deep state. It's like I know people that would be in the quote unquote deep state. And so it was really interesting reading this because I realized, to some degree, I'm not sure I owe anyone an apology, but I think I've probably said some things over the years that in actuality weren't correct. And in terms of who's driving what and whether we need to be concerned about it and all that. So if you wouldn't mind if explicating your thesis and why you use the terminology Madisonian and Trumanite, that would
Sure.
be. Yeah.
Well, first of all, many people have said it's a book about the deep state, and
Yeah.
I suppose in one sense it is. But I think that the central lesson that people will and should come away with is that, well, there is a national security state. It's not very deep. It's been hiding in plain sight for
Right.
decades. And
Mhm.
the concerns about the concentration of power in a small handful of national security managers are well founded. But
Mhm.
it's not as though there's a deep, dark conspiracy that has aimed at hiding its existence from the American people, which
Right.
leads to the point that you made, and which I felt very strongly. The so-called the Trumanite network, the network of managers, of the several hundred individuals in uh, the top ranks of the CIA, the FBI, the Justice Department, the State Department, uh, who run the national security apparatus, are hardworking, patriotic experts for the most part. This is not
Mhm.
um, an expose of wanton corruption and avarice. And
Right.
um, uh, I thought, in fairness, I should portray the people that I had um, experienced in this intelligence investigation in the 1970s, several of whom I became close friends with. Um, it was not as though they were, um, in any sense, anti patriotic, anti constitutional, or anything of the sort. So, the thesis of Badgett is, I think, fascinating and quite apropos to what I had seen and experienced. And the thesis was this: um, Badgett sought to explain how Britain had moved from a monarchy to a republic, a concealed republic, as he put it. And he explained it with this concept of double government. He said Britain, in the course of the centuries, developed um, two sets of institutions: dignified and efficient institutions. The dignified institutions were the front facing public institutions that the people, the British public, thought ran the British government, principally the monarchy, the House of
Mhm.
Lords. But Badgett said that was illusory. The government was really run by a set of efficient institutions: the prime minister, the cabinet, House of Commons. And I suppose one would have to add today, of course, the bureaucracy. It was not that
Mhm.
big in the 1860s. So, over the course of British history, Badgett suggested power transferred slowly and quietly from the dignified institutions to the efficient institutions. And Britain moved from being a monarchy to a concealed republic.
Mhm.
My thesis in the book is that the United States underwent a similar transition, but in reverse. We too had something like the dignified institutions. I refer to these as the Madisonian institutions, the three constitutionally established branches of the federal government:
Mhm.
the Congress, the presidency, and the courts. And uh, the efficient institution I call the Trumanite Network in the book, owing its name to the establishment of the national security apparatus largely during the Truman administration. When the CIA was set up, the uh, power was consolidated in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Pentagon, the NSA shortly thereafter.
Mhm.
And my point in the book is that in the United States, the power has moved in the reverse direction. It,
Yeah.
it's moved from the Madisonian institutions to the Trumanite network. And as a consequence, the United States has moved uh, more and more year by year away from a pluralistic democratic system to a autocratic system in which this small group of several hundred individuals largely define and manage uh, American national security policy.
Yeah. So, gosh, to what degree would you? Okay, so let's for a moment let's assume for the sake of argument that's all correct and makes sense. There is going to be there are reasons that we got to this point, right? And I remember reading Mary Beard's SPQR, about the history of the
Yeah,
Roman Empire.
yeah.
She a great book, and she wrote, and I got to find the page where this is because I want to use it in an article. But she says, people need to understand that the fall of the republic, the transition to an empire, came about not just because of the ambitions of Caesar and Pompey and whatnot, but because it had grown to the point where their system of government couldn't really handle it. The empire was almost a response to the conditions. And to what degree do you think it would be fair to say that, like, this transition in the U.S. from a pluralistic democracy to at least a national security, something that's a little more autocratic, uh, is that a response to the conditions coming out of World War II? Is this organic? Uh, what how should we look at its origins?
I'm not into unicausality, and you ask a hard question. What
Yeah.
drove it? And I'll pick out three from among many drivers. Um, the size of the country and the complexity of the society, the incentive structure that is built into um, each of these two flip sides of the government, the Trumanites and the Madisonians,
Hmm.
and also the threats from the
Right.
Soviet Union during the Cold War. So Madison, as you know, in the Federalist Papers, tried to answer the argument of the anti-federalists that this was not going to work in a big country.
Right.
The Constitution that you're thinking of, James Madison, is um, based on theories of democracy that only work in small towns in New England. And Madison
Hmm.
famously responded that this was a representative democracy and that there were advantages in size. Um, Madison failed to anticipate two things that went along with the vast expansion of the population. Number one, the emergence of political parties. It wasn't until after the Constitutional Convention that he and Jefferson took that famous botany expedition to New York, which was intended, in fact, to found the Democratic Party, the Democratic Jeffersonian Party,
Mm-hmm.
Democratic Republican Party at the time. The second thing, of course, that they failed to anticipate was necessitated by the growing size of the country, and that is bureaucracy. When Thomas Jefferson moved into the White House in 1801, the entire federal bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. consisted of 132 people. Jefferson Jefferson's staff consisted one person, his private secretary, one person on the White House staff.
My gosh.
Of course, you've got 3 to 4 million people working for this humongous bureaucracy,
Hmm.
which is, of course, to an extent, necessitated by the size and complexity of the country. So, anyway, in answer to your question, the first driver has been the size of the country.
Yeah.
Um, The second is the incentive structure that flows from um, the system of separated powers itself. Um, Members of Congress and uh, executive officials, not members of the Trumanite Network, but the president's personal staffs, the National Security Council staff, uh, of State Department officials that are within the president's writ.
Mhm.
President appoints 3 to 4,000 people uh,
Mhm.
each term, um,
Yeah.
within his authority, and roughly about only, depending upon how you count, fewer than 1,000 in the national security realm. Most of
Mhm.
these are of his assistants on the National Security Council staff. His personal staff come from they're seconded from the bureaucracy. He doesn't appoint them himself.
Right.
It's
Okay.
not really proper to refer to them as his staff. Anyway, um, there's an incentive structure that has 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 driven the transfer of power from the Madisonian institutions to the Trumanite Network, and it's it, it, it relates to the desire of um, uh, members of Congress, members of congressional oversight committees, to pass the buck, for one thing, to appear to be powerful without having to make what are politically life and death decisions, career ending decisions concerning, for
Right.
example, use of force.
Yeah.
They love to talk about, recapturing the war power, but they don't really want to be forced to cast votes on any of the controversial uses of force that have
Yeah.
occurred over the last 30 years. So they have an incentive, particularly since they don't really have any expertise on things like, terrorist groups and um, the myriad issues that are created legally and policy wide
Yeah.
in fighting terrorism. So they're um, just delighted to pass the buck to people in the CIA and the Pentagon and NSA. Those people, on the other hand, regard themselves as the true professionals, and in a way, they are. They're the
Mhm.
experts. They don't
Yeah.
like they don't like you know congressional generalists or their staffers looking over their shoulders, kibitzing, um, and making dumb suggestions. They want to do it themselves. And
Right.
so this is a vastly oversimplified way. It's much more complicated than that of describing the incentive structure that has pushed the decision making process into the Trumanites' hands. And finally, there is the very real threats that existed during the Cold War and
Yeah.
thereafter. I mean, the reality is, if you're going to have a massive um, global presence, as the United States does, you need um, intelligence services to back up the military in protecting uh, that. I hesitate to call it an empire. It's a lot different from the Roman
Sure.
Empire, but the ability to intervene anywhere in the world, uh, and the requisite 847 bases that are required to support that capability, um, require a vast national security apparatus, and we have one.
Yeah.
So um, this is a long-winded answer to what really is the ultimate question: why? Why did this
Yeah.
happen? And you know, the book has lots more to say about this, obviously.
Yeah. It's so, man, yeah, no, that's I mean, obviously it's very complicated and hard to say. I don't know. There's, yes, a good answer to a difficult question, I think. Returning to when you wrote the book, so this came out in your initial article on which the book is based came out in 2014. So during the
Yes,
Obama administration, and Obama was still president when the book came out.
yes.
So, and one thing you note, right in the introduction, it starts like, I think your case is made very quickly because you note that, then Senator Obama, he really campaigned against much of what he continued once he became president. And then you have the three theses, one comes into office, sees that, oh, this stuff is actually like they actually were doing, the Bush administration was doing the right thing, what they were doing on terrorism and in Iraq and Afghanistan. It made sense. And now that I have this information I didn't previously have, makes sense. And we're going to continue. And then, the second option is that he was merely a duplicitous politician who didn't really care one way or the other. And so, gets into office, drops what he ran on, and we're going on with that. And, that one, I think rightly you comment on less. That's it's all supposition. Um, but then the third explanation, is basically that it's really the national security state driving this. But then you, in our email correspondence, you directed me to an article that you had written. I'm going to get the date wrong. Was it 2017 you wrote it? Was it
Something
something? The
during the
relative.
first, I forget.
Yeah, I think it was in the first little bit of our then President Trump and now current President Trump's
That's
first
right. Yes, that's right.
administration.
Yes.
And clearly he approaches things a little differently and kind of defies, like came into office, explicitly running against the quote unquote deep state. But to take that article and to kind of see what's happening now, obviously it's been an interesting couple of weeks with the Ukraine and Russia negotiations. Um, he he seems to be. I don't know if breaking this paradigm is the right way to say it, but he certainly challenges it, and I'd love to get your commentary on that.
Well, this is extremely important, and uh, it's something that Bagehot actually addressed directly in his theory. Um, First, I should I should describe one additional aspect of Bagehot's theory
Okay.
because it bears directly on this issue. Bagehot hypothesized that for double government to work, it was critically important that the two sets of institutions projected an image of public harmony. There could
Right.
be no daylight between them publicly. They had to appear in absolute agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that, if you think about it, and Bagehot hints about this, he says that the system would fall to earth like a spinning top that moved off the table if they were to diverge and go after each other's throats.
Yeah.
The reason is they both need each other for legitimacy purposes. In contemporary terms, the Trumanite network, the national security state, has no electoral connection.
Right.
Legitimacy in a democracy is conferred by being voted for. Nobody
Yeah.
votes for the director of the Central Intelligence or FBI director, etc. So they derive legitimacy derivatively from the Madisonian institutions responsible for their existence.
Yeah.
If they are cut off in the public's mind from those institutions, that they have no freestanding legitimacy. And therefore, there is no necessary reason to respect their judgments or obey their decrees.
Yeah.
And that's very dangerous in a national emergency, obviously, if
Hmm.
they lose credibility. So, secondly, the the Madisonian institutions also depend for their legitimacy and national security policymaking on the public's belief that they're not just, reading um, these talking points from the Babylon Bee. They're 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 getting great intelligence from, satellite imagery and
Yeah.
document and all the secret ways that the NSA and CIA inform our elected leaders as to what the best policy is. So,
Hmm.
for these reasons, it's critically important that they not be at each other's throats.
Hmm.
And Badgett predicted in his book, as I predicted in mine, that it was therefore highly improbable that you'd ever have an open break between these two sets of institutions. It's Harry Carey for
Right.
both of them. And that's exactly what's happened. Nonetheless, it happened in the first Trump administration, and it's
Yeah.
happening before our eyes now. I mean,
Yeah.
I just yesterday read the most extraordinary letter from the Attorney General, Pam Bondi,
Mm.
to Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, in which she accuses the FBI of withholding the Epstein files and videotapes from her. And she orders Patel and the FBI to have them on her desk by 2 hours ago, 8 o'clock this morning.
I'm
You,
sure
the letter is
X as it
online.
was. Yeah.
You talk about a split, about open warfare between these two institutions. Um, this is exactly what Badgett predicted would lead to great instability, and
Yeah.
um, and therefore an unpredictability with respect to the continuity of national security policy, which gets to your question about Ukraine and Russia. This is a completely discontinuous policy. I mean, it changed overnight as soon as this never would have happened before. But
Yeah.
it goes hand in hand with uh, Trump's war on the national security bureaucracy and his effort to impose a kind of unitary government model on not simply the national security state, but everybody else in the bureaucracy as well. So um, that's where things stand. And in terms of Badgett's theory, um, it's anybody's guess as to where this will lead because the top is spinning off the table, and we've never been
Yeah.
before.
Yeah. That's interesting and kind of darkly funny and sobering. It was interesting to me reading the article after reading the book because so when you wrote this article in the relatively early days of the Trump administration, you included a number of quotes from let's say Democrats and various former members of the Trumanite Network. And I can't remember who the quote was from, but someone alluded to how these these Trumanites, these agencies, they have ways to hurt the president, and Trump is making a huge mistake. And now, years later, I'm speaking from the outside. Certainly was not part of the government. Uh, it is not clear that Trump really suffered any consequences.
Boy, I wouldn't jump to that conclusion at
Okay.
all.
Okay.
I think
Interesting.
the votes are still out on that. I
Okay.
I will believe it when I see it, the Epstein files or the JFK files. I think there's a major war going on behind the scenes between Trump
Yeah.
appointees, people like Pam Bondi and Kash Patel, and the dug-in Trumanite network. Um,
Okay. So just as the conversation really started getting good, Google Chrome crashed. It may or may not have had something to do with my having approximately 150 tabs open, but whatever the reasons may be, it crashed, which put us in a pretty uncomfortable situation. Professor Glennon very graciously was patient enough to wait on me to send him a new link and then record the second half of the conversation, not knowing if that first half was saved. I'm sure it was frustrating for him. It was deeply uncomfortable and nerve wracking for me as the guy that had gotten this esteemed academic to agree to appear on a podcast with a relatively small audience. I was rather banking on the technology working. But anyway, so we did the whole second half of the interview, not knowing if the first half would be saved. Afterwards, I recorded a 23-minute intro, trying to get all the major parts of the conversation that I thought had maybe been deleted. Anyway, it turns out the backup was there. It was saved. You obviously are only listening to this now because you heard the first half of the conversation that we thought might very well have disappeared into the ether. Anyway, enjoy the second half of the conversation and forgive any slight hiccups in the transition or any breaks in the momentum. Yeah, that's because the internet crashed and there was about a 5-minute interlude in between what we were just talking about and what we're talking about next. All right, back to the podcast. You were talking about how uh, so basically, Senator Chuck Schumer, my former senator, had intimated that the national security apparatus has this, has a whole lot that they can do against the president. And President Trump was really taking a serious risk by going to battle publicly with them, and uh, and that's what we were talking about.
yes, I think this is another reason that, of course, one would have expected Trump uh, not to take on the so-called deep state because they're very powerful.
Yeah.
And we talked earlier about um, Senator Church and my work with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Your comment about Schumer warning Trump that the CIA has um, 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you, and you better not cross them. I was reminded of a an incident that occurred, I think in the late 1970s, when Richard Helms, the
Mm.
former director of the CIA, um, was convicted of making a false statement before Frank Church's subcommittee
Hmm.
on multinational corporations, and uh, he was represented by leading Washington lawyer Edward Bennett Williams, owner of the Washington Redskins, and very prominent in Washington society. And
Hmm.
Williams, um, after the guilty verdict was handed down, held a press conference saying that his client, Richard Helms, would wear this conviction like a badge of honor.
Hmm.
Lying to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is worthy of a badge of honor. I, as a young, naive staffer at the time, didn't think that was quite right. I mean, we're talking, after all, about the truth-finding process of the legislative branch on
Hmm.
which the integrity of the entire legal structure depends. No, I didn't
Hmm.
think that was actually accurate to say it was a badge of honor. It was a shameful thing to
Yeah.
have, to have to have made these statements. And so I wrote an op-ed piece um, saying that and disagreeing with William's statement that it was a badge of honor. Um, and my idea was, so this would be published by a member of the committee, of course, not
Yeah.
under my own name. I don't publish things under my own name as the committee's lawyer. So I I started at the top of the committee with this op-ed, and one after the next, each member of the committee said, no, 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 I don't want to publish that.
Yeah.
And one of the leading members of the committee, I remember very distinctly, said to me, Mike, you got to be crazy. Nobody on this committee is going to sign his name to that op-ed piece. Don't you realize how powerful those people are?
Yeah.
And so, naively, I continued down, and sure enough, a freshman senator, Dick Clark of Iowa, finally said yes, and it was published in the New York Times as an op-ed under his name.
No kidding.
But it just struck me at the time that, boy, this is an extremely unfortunate state of affairs that the national security apparatus has exercised this chill over the this bastion of liberal internationalism, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and otherwise, courageous and intelligent and civic-minded senators wouldn't begin to think of standing up to them. So
Yeah.
I'm all the more surprised that a president of the United States is willing to do this. It's and I don't have any confidence that he will succeed.
Interesting. And when you say succeed, so like what would succeeding look like? What would not succeeding look like?
Well, there are some obvious tells that
Yeah.
will indicate success. One is releasing the Epstein files.
Hmm.
The intelligence community is and the FBI are extremely opposed to that. Second, releasing the JFK assassination files. Again, they've been fighting tooth and nail against this for decades, even though there's a law that requires those files to be released.
Yeah.
So, at a very superficial level, you can look at a handful of things like those two examples and know whether Trump is succeeding. At this point, they're not succeeding. I mean, Pam Bondi seems to be uh, an intelligent and dedicated and sincere person, but she was played by the FBI, and you have to wonder whether she's in over her head. She
Hmm.
never should have said, I've got these files on my desk, and proceeded to talk about what was in them. She's going to lose confidence, the confidence of her supporters very, very quickly if she doesn't get on top of this. And I think it's going to go all the way up to Trump because Trump and Kash Patel and Bondi have all promised a quick release of the Epstein files and the JFK
Yeah.
assassination files. So, what would it look like um, beyond that? I think um, you know that it's very hard for the public to know
Yeah.
whether Trump will have succeeded because much of what we're talking about happens behind closed doors. And we only have gotten glimpses of the fight over the Epstein files. You can be sure that there are all kinds of struggles going on like that right now
Yeah.
within the executive branch and between the president and the national security apparatus. So, um, I mean, ideally, it would mean something that Trump, in my view, has not come out strongly enough in favor of, and that is um, restoration of a vibrant system of separation of powers, which means
Hmm.
not simply a strong executive,
Yeah.
a Congress that exercises oversight rather than hindsight when it comes to monitoring the intelligence community and the FBI. And I think we're a long, long ways from that right now. But um, so this is my principal concern about the Trump administration. I don't see a vigorous commitment to restoring Congress to its its um, intended role in the realm of war powers, treaty powers, executive agreements, budgetary authority,
Yeah.
intelligence oversight. Um, I'd be much more comfortable with the Trump administration if they made that a priority.
Interesting. Yeah, and it doesn't seem at this point like it will be for one reason or another, but we'll see what happens. You write in the book about kind of the antidote to some of this, and you write about a restoration of civic virtue. It'd be interesting to kind of get your take. Like, what do you mean by that? What exactly is the outcome you're trying to achieve through that restoration?
Yes, this is a critically important part of the whole system. The framers did not believe that this structure that is set up in the tripartite system of the Constitution would be a machine that runs of itself and remains in equilibrium because ambition counteracts ambition. And when one branch invades the prerogatives of another, that branch would respond in kind.
Yeah.
They thought in order to achieve an equilibrium of power, which they said was the only way to preclude the emergence of autocracy, to ensure an equilibrium of power, you needed civic virtue. And you needed civic virtue at two different levels. Number one, on the part of a populace that was um, informed and uh, able to engage in deliberation
Hmm.
as a commitment to a notion of the rule of law that contemplated accepting the results of the system even when you disagreed with those results.
Yeah.
This is a Lamborghini of political systems. You need a pretty sophisticated electorate to comprehend the need for obeying judicial decisions and legislative decisions you disagree with. And of course, free speech is
Hmm.
founded on that same premise that, as Holmes said, freedom of speech means freedom for the idea that you hate. Most people, uh, young people in particular these days, think free speech means free speech for the ideas you agree with, and other ideas should be suppressed.
Well, those are the best ones,
Yeah, of course. Um, so you need civic virtue um,
Yeah.
in the populace, but you also need civic virtue among the individuals who are elected,
Right.
and a commitment to constitutional principles and the integrity of the office that you hold in the courts or the legislature or the executive, which means resisting encroachments from the other two branches or from the states.
Yeah.
Um, and absent um, uh, civic virtue at these two levels, the whole system collapses. And this is what Learned Hand, of course, was getting at in his famous observation that when the spirit of liberty dies in the hearts of the people, no constitution, no law, no court can save it.
Hmm.
Ultimately, this is a cultural question and an educational question. And I think that the schools, the colleges, and the universities in particular have failed miserably in giving students even the most modest understanding of what is entailed in being a responsible citizen in a democracy.
What are there any, uh, possible and politically possible reforms that you think would help rectify that issue?
Well, not the sorts of reforms that we lawyers are used to talking about.
Hmm.
It's impossible and uh, naive to think that anybody can come up with a 5 point program which, if enacted into law, is going to solve the double government problem and
Right.
restore
Right.
vitality to the separation of powers.
Right.
That's not going to happen. And
Okay.
I describe why in the book, and it comes down ultimately to the fact that in order to enact these kinds of reforms, you'd in effect be calling upon the Madisonian institutions to exercise the very powers that they lack, which you're
Mm.
trying to restore.
Hmm.
And this circularity is um, impossible to overcome. The energy has to come from the outside, from an enlightened populace,
Yeah.
not from within the system itself. So there are, minor things that you could talk about, but it doesn't make sense to envision, for example, you know, um, fixing the War Powers Resolution or the FISA Court or any of these other institutions or congressional oversight if you're within a context of a society and members of Congress who lack civic virtue, members of Congress who have the continuing incentive to play a ceremonial role rather than the role of a decision maker
Yeah.
because they don't want to jeopardize their political careers by voting whether to do X in Ukraine. They
Right.
prefer to, as I was saying earlier, push that question off to the Trumanites. And the
Yeah.
Congress is filled with people like that. So the real any reformer has to ask, you know, what's the problem? Why is Congress filled with people who don't have pride of office and an
Hmm.
attachment to um, the constitutional responsibilities of the Congress? And that's an extremely complicated question. It has to do with lots and lots of different things, including the role of money in
Hmm.
electoral campaigns. Um, but the that's a whole different subject, and we
Right.
can get into that some other day. But
Yeah. No, it's interesting. One of the things I was left with, anytime you're talking about something as big as this, where the fix is basically that everyone, the populace and Congress, you end up with a lot more civic virtue because ultimately, you're right. It's not as simple as lawyers coming up with something and them just passing it. It's like you need people to voluntarily kind of do what they were supposed to do, which I think is a taller order. And so you're left with this kind of I don't know if it's depressing or sober, whatever sense would be, but just like, oh, this would, like that's not going to happen. And then but the system, and this is one thing that I think to me is interesting about our system of government, is that even when it's not staffed by particularly virtuous people, in the civic sense certainly, and then
yeah,
probably in the other sense too, uh, and even when the populace is not, we would say, particularly well informed all the time, for many, normal and valid reasons, who can spend all day thinking about politics, but lawyers and professors and whatnot. Uh, the country still, as of yet, stands, and I recall this is kind of funny. This is a point we were discussing earlier where Congress for good, there are perfectly legitimate reasons that they defer to the national security state on it. So one of the primary ones being that they come into office having never had access to all this clandestine information before, and not being experts, not spending their lives doing whatever. They might be bankers, farmers, lawyers, and they might have expertise in those fields, but they don't in the myriad areas in which they're now required to opine. When I was 25, I interned for a Democratic state senator here in Utah on Capitol Hill during Utah's legislative session. Obviously, Utah's government is much smaller than the federal government, and they're dealing with much more local issues. There's not a whole lot to do with national security, that level of import. Nothing that rises to that level of import. And that's the closest I've ever gotten to anarcho-libertarianism. I think because it was like they were being asked to vote on things they had no idea about, and didn't have time to learn about. They were passing bills on 10 different subjects a day, and they didn't have time to read the bills. That's why they were talking to lobbyists, because they didn't, like what's the Democratic position on importing contacts into the state of Utah? Like, don't have one, and so got to have someone tell them what it is. And I came out thinking, it's like, my gosh, like, not only are these people completely, and my senator was great, but looking at the Senate and the legislature writ large, it was, my gosh, these people are not up to the task.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking, I'm not sure anyone could be up to that task.
Well, this is a terribly difficult problem, and of course, you've just described why legislators defer to experts.
Right.
And it's true in the realm of national security as elsewhere. And it's even a more pressing problem on Capitol Hill when you're dealing with all of the issues that a generalist at the federal level has to deal with. So, um, I mean, this is, as I say, a subject for a, a, a long colloquium with people who have thought about the division of labor um,
Yeah.
among legislators, but there's no simple solution to the problem that you've just put your finger on, and it's the central problem. How does a generalist compete with technocrats?
Yeah.
And there's no easy way to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, as you know, the best legislators stay up into the late hours of the night trying to keep up with the bills and uh, measures that they're asked to vote on, and it's just an impossible task to be on top of everything.
Yeah.
Responsible job.
Yeah. That's an interesting point to end this, because it's not necessarily the most, not the most uplifting, um, because but like, the reality is that I think that the government is staffed by humans at every level. They're all human, and a lot of what they do, even if to the public it might seem nefarious or uh, just misguided or dumb or whatever the term may be, it's it's human, and it tends to be in response to the incentive structures where they're at. You write about that beautifully in the book. I think that it's not on Congress, and it certainly in the national security state. It's not like these are people that are doing things because they want to hurt America or anything like that. It's there's a lot of they're responding to self-preservationist instinct, and to a degree doing the best they can under difficult circumstances.
Well, it's your comments remind me of that old observation of Immanuel Kant. He said, um, "From the crooked timbers of humanity, no straight thing was ever made." We're doing our best to make a straight thing with this legislative process, And maybe it is, as Churchill said, a comparative matter in the end, compared to what.
Right.
But when you look at it closely, boy, it sure strikes you that we've been awfully lucky
Mm.
to get as far as we have with this system. And I think we've had some pretty close calls recently.
Hmm.
The Fifth Circuit was, I think, right in in its conclusion that this massive censorship regime that was put in place uh, with federal pressure on um, social media to
Mm-hmm.
take down posts that it disfavored, even
Mm.
posts that were true, was just a, a massive violation of the First Amendment, maybe the most massive violation of the First Amendment that's ever occurred in American history. So, you can't get along for long in a country like this without a vibrant and robust marketplace of ideas.
Right.
And we came very close to losing that uh, just within the last few years. Very, very close. And that's the abyss from which there is no return, to return to Frank Church's words. He was
Yeah.
referring to NSA surveillance, but it's true also if you give up freedom of expression. That's an irreversible mistake.
It's really interesting you mentioned that because, obviously on the left, one of the primary criticisms levied at Trump and by implication at his supporters, and maybe sometimes it's true, is that he is, authoritarian, fascistic, these various bad things that we would associate with historically awful people. And it's easy, I think it's very easy to kind of miss the sins of your own side. And I've heard for years, from family and friends on the right, about just what you're talking about these efforts of the political left and the non and both people in office and then very much out of office to suppress that marketplace of ideas. And so what it sounds like you're saying, like to you, that's a very serious issue. It's not just you know yeah, like that's a serious issue.
I think that's the most serious issue. And
Okay.
it's made even more serious. And we haven't had a chance to get into this, and maybe this is for a different day, but it's made even more serious by the joinder of private and public power in the form of the social media on the one hand and the security state that acted as the puppet masters of Twitter before Musk bought it.
Hmm.
And, you know, uh, Zuckerberg just wrote a letter to the Congressional Oversight Committee describing the pressure that was put on Facebook during the Biden administration to take down material from Facebook that was true but was politically harmful to Biden's prospects. And of course, they did that. The Supreme Court didn't reach the merits in Missouri versus Biden, Murphy versus
Hmm.
Biden now. Um, but we came very close, getting back to your earlier thought that the country just seems to survive. We have this magic touch. I think we've been very, very lucky many times, and we should stop taking our good fortune for granted,
Mm.
because just recently came very close to losing our freedom in this country.
Interesting. And final question, then I'll let you go. You've been very generous with your time this morning. Just want to kind of trace out how you reached your beliefs on what is so important, because when we're talking now, and you're expressing views that would be more commonly held on the political right, but you've spoken of your admiration for Frank Church, who was very famously, not now, because he passed away quite a while ago, but at the time he was very famously a liberal and quite to the left of his own party, and he was the last Democratic senator from Idaho. He was brave, a brave, forthright liberal. And so, where was your personal evolution in terms of landing on freedom of speech, these particular freedoms, and these things as important issues?
I hate to say it, but I haven't evolved all that much. My
Mm.
views on freedom of speech, in particular, but um, most foreign policy issues haven't changed a whole lot since I worked for Frank Church and Mike
Hmm.
Mansfield and Jacob Javits and the J. William Fulbright and the leaders of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. My sense is that the country has changed and that the two political parties have largely inverted, and that the Democratic Party, that used to be the party for free speech and individual and political liberty, has largely switched sides. And it's very
Hmm.
distressing to me to see that.
Hmm.
So um, maybe I need to be more open minded uh, and, and, and flexible, but I guess I'm getting old.
Far be it from me to tell you to change anything. That no, that's really interesting. It's a good answer. That's a and even like I'm sure, thinking of my listeners who do fall on both the left and the right and the middle and the semi adjacent and the not on the spectrum at all. Uh, it's good to. I'm sure there are people that would disagree with you, and I'm not sure that I know enough to do so, but it's. It's important, I think, to hear very thoughtful uh, people express ideas that you haven't heard before, that you don't agree with, and just kind of, because one of the fundamental reasons that I started doing this, that I wanted to do it, was that you know I grew up in Utah. You know, I was raised by a woman from Georgia, married a woman from Georgia. I, I do, like, I personally lean to the left, and much of my family does, but I've certainly been around a lot of people that don't, and I've met a lot of people on the right that have formed their views of the left. It's entirely based on caricatures. They'd never be able to convince a Democrat that they're right, because the concerns that they're trying to address are not actual Democratic concerns. The arguments to which they formed their counter arguments are not Democratic arguments. They might have heard them on, conservative TV or whatnot, but you're never going to convince an actual Democrat. And it's like, oh, geez, man, these conservatives, they're nuts. And then go to law school, and then especially move to New York, and I meet brilliant people that have literally never met a social conservative, or at least never knowingly met and talked to one. And so it's same deal going the other way. It has nothing to do with intelligence or education level or anything like that. It's just that, if you're not exposed really to the best or even the good of the other side, it's very difficult to find the holes in your own views.
It's hard to do that in this society. You really have to curate the news yourself and make a conscious effort to read from both ends of the spectrum. And if you don't do that, you will be uninformed.
Yeah. Well, Professor Michael Glennon of Tufts University, this has been an absolute pleasure and fascinating. And if we don't get the rest of that recording back, I'm going to cry, but I'm going to do a great monologue to hopefully. I won't imitate. Well, I probably won't imitate your voice to get everything in. We'll get the information to the people. Make sure to recommend that they read this great book, which is, I will note, it's dense, but it's not long. it's very idea heavy, but it can be read and I think digested without too much difficulty. But thank you again, and yeah, thank you.
Nick, thank you. I've really very much enjoyed it. I appreciate your having me on. Thank you.
All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.